Hello, everybody, and welcome to a long overdue edition of Tabletop History. And as I'm recording this, it is the pre-release day for the second edition of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. And so I thought it would be fun to go back and take a look at all of the editions of Warhammer Fantasy over the years, talk about when they came out, what they were, what was their character, and some oddities of them, things like that. Because I think it's easy to assume that Warhammer always looked like it did whenever you started playing. That is to say, I think most people have this image of like, this is Warhammer, and it's based largely on whenever they started. Because the game has changed character a lot over the years, and there's these interesting sort of cycles and rhythms. It's like poetry, it rhymes, throughout the history of Warhammer. And so I thought it'd be fun to go back and look at all of them and have a little chat. So let's do that. So we start with first edition, obviously. It wasn't really thought of that at the time, but, it was just Warhammer, the mass combat fantasy role-playing game. So much to unpack here. All right, so this was released in 1983, written by your original Big Three from Games Workshop. If you watched my History of Games Workshop video, then in this same series, then you know these three names. It was very RPG focused. Obviously, it's there on the cover. Mass combat fantasy role-playing game, right? It's in the title. We have an awesome piece of art on the cover, the introduction of our Harry the Hammer, or whatever his name is, the classic sort of guy here. This is about the only color art done for this entire edition, I should say. Most of the art at this time, obviously, and throughout most of the 80s was black and white. What set this edition apart was sort of I shouldn't say what set this edition apart. I should say what set this apart from its contemporaries. That's the better way to say it. Was that it had this big focus on magic. And there's an interesting thing here where, throughout most of Warhammer, there's been this concept of sort of the 4 levels of wizards. That was introduced here. Now, I should state that within this edition, there was also this whole system of amulets, where wizards had to have certain amulets to cast. And that will go away quickly when we get to second edition. There's also a really interesting concept here, though, that sort of defined the core of what the Warhammer world would be. And it comes through in the magic rules. When wizards cast spells, in this edition, they would drain a constitution score, and when they got to 0, they couldn't cast anymore. Magic was also very fallible. It could injure the caster. It was dangerous. I think right here you get the unpacking of a lot of the core assumptions. These guys, when they were designing this at this time, they grew up on a lot of the sword and sorcery and those kinds of dark, gritty, Conan-like adventures from the 60s and 70s. And so when it came time for them to redefine their own fantasy world, they weren't drawing as much from sort of the Tolkien aspect in theme and tone, but rather from their other experiences around that. Now, that's a minimal touch in this edition, because you have to understand, there is very little background in this edition. Do not think of this as the Warhammer world It is not. There are, as I have here down at the bottom with our oddities, it did come with this interesting campaign called the Red Wake River Valley, which had rules for, character advancement and all sorts of stuff. Night elves were part of the world, red goblins, there's all sorts of weird stuff creeping around the edges. The things you think of as Warhammer and that world did not exist yet. They were not part of the game. Most of the concepts aren't there. The idea of even chaos is very ill-defined. All of this stuff the world still feels much more traditional fantasy, but there's that underbelly, that seedy, gritty underbelly was there. That's what I want to point to. From the beginning, that was there. And it got expressed in interesting ways through things like the magic, where if you look at other fantasy templates at the time, magic wasn't costly or destructive to one's soul and stuff like that. Whereas right here in the initial impressions of Warhammer, what you see is that magic is this dangerous, unnatural thing And that would become a mainstay of Warhammer that gets expressed in much stronger terms as the game evolves. First edition had a couple different book releases to support it. It was getting a lot of support in White Dwarf. Over this time, White Dwarf will shift, like between first and second edition in those time periods. White Dwarf will shift to become an in-house magazine that basically only supports what's going on here with Games Workshop. The rules at this time, though, were still just books. There's no box set or things like that we think of. This was done because of largely, as I mentioned in the GW history video, like this picks up right when we left off with the early years of GW. This was done because of the partnership with Citadel Miniatures. So the rules would specifically reference Citadel Miniatures, like order this miniature, number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, to match this troop, right? Okay. But everything was very free-flowing. It was much more open. The world was very squidgy, let's call it, at this point. But there were elements here that would become mainstays to Warhammer throughout its life. Just as a nice little example, here's a sample character. And you can see some of the elements, but it's very different. All right, so second edition. Second edition was released in 1984. That's right, 1984. I know I just said 1983 was the previous one. So this came out pretty fast. It incorporated a lot of the expansion material from Forces of Fantasy and White Dwarf. And this kind of quick release is not uncommon in the early years of RPGs, especially in the late 70s and early 80s. D&D had much a similar track. The important thing to understand is that in this time period, the making of these games was not a professional thing. Like, there wasn't these big companies really doing this. And the fact that we even know what Warhammer is survivor bias. That same year, there were 100 similar games released. Most of them are relegated to the ash bin of history. You have no idea what they are. You will never know what they are. And they are largely irrelevant. That's not a judgment on their quality. They might have, in fact, been gems or great games, but it didn't matter because they didn't hit. And so what would happen is you'd get tons of these releases, these small games, as all these individuals and little small groups of 2 and 3 people are making games. And when they were doing so, sometimes they would hit, and Warhammer hit. And then they would be getting like 72 questions a day by post for clarifications on rules, and they would say, uh-oh, we got a lot of people asking us questions. We got a big market. We better go ahead and, we better clean this up. Hence, second edition. Second edition came, as you can see, in a box. That's what came in the box. The Battle Bestiary, Battle Magic, and Combat, as well as some, sort of rule sheets, and the magnificent Sven. Oh, yes. So here is where we see the introduction of something that would persist throughout second and third edition, which was we would have these little adventure campaign things or other supplements that would be puns, puns on other existing things. They would have puns on Macbeth and Macdeath and all sorts of other stuff. But yeah, the magnificent Sven. One of the things that I think made Warhammer hit and has kept it in the consciousness, one of its great advantages, is that it has an incredibly unique tone. It's famously said there are only 2 types of stories, comedy and tragedy. Somehow Warhammer is both. It is a dark, gritty world clearly inspired by the likes of sort of 60s sword and sorcery. As I mentioned, these people grew up on that. The writers grew up on that stuff. I mean, look at that combat book. Look at it. Look at that cover. Conan much? That's like, I'm not trying to say it's derivative, but I'm saying like that is that art style. That is sword and sorcery art if I have ever seen it. But at the same time, the authors included this gallows humor. The world had a funny edge to it. And it would continue to have a comedy edge to it throughout a lot of its time, although how much comedy was there would sort of rise and fall. Throughout these early years, there was a lot of comedy. There was a lot of humor put in the game. And I think that combination of sort of deadly, dark, serious stuff and wackiness. Woohoo! It's funny. I think that strange combination would become a sort of chocolate and peanut butter, and I think it's what set it apart from its contemporaries, and I think it's one of the things that kept it popular in the conscious, in the zeitgeist. Now, what's interesting here is that the amount of comedy that is appropriate, and I just made little finger air quotes, is so different based on the individual person. Like, I love goofiness and comedy in the games. I don't take this very seriously. So I like things to be wacky and funny and stuff like that. I think it makes me smile. I think the game should be fun and wacky. But there are a lot of people who are like, oh no, this game should be so dark. It's chaos. They're going to destroy the world. And so, like if any amount of comedy comes in or if it gets too far, they immediately push back and say, this isn't my Warhammer. Warhammer is a serious thing. It's a dark world and a gritty world. It needs to get out of here. If you go back to the beginning, that is simply not the case. There is, humor is ever present in this world. And it is a gallows humor. It's, yes, the world is dark, hence to survive, humor. Right? And it's been a sort of identity crisis for Warhammer throughout its history as to how much comedy can the game and the audience withstand before they feel like it's gotten too silly. Second edition notably started to define the world. This is where we start to see the Warhammer world that we think of come into focus. Not completely, but sort of. And so this is where we get the introduction of the Inter-Elf Wars, and we get some of the background on the Slann, who at this time, by the way, are alien descendant genetic experiments. Like aliens. I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens. Like that kind. And we get a little bit of chaos, although we won't get them finalized until the next edition. Chaos doesn't really come into its own as what the heck chaos is until the next edition. But we get that sort of timeline. We start to get the world. We start to get a feel for it. And it's not just a foggy notion anymore. As well, in this edition, magic is going to continue to expand. It gets even crazier. So in addition to the wizards, which we have these different levels and stuff, as we saw before, we get focuses for casters, very similar to D&D specialization. Again, there are still very strong role-playing elements in this, character advancement, stuff like that. Second edition introduced a points system. Yeah, that wasn't in there before. And as I went back and did this research, I realized this, and I was like, oh my god, that is a hilarious parallel. Because you have the initial game, released in 1983, and it doesn't really have points. And defining and the way you get at armies is kind of, let's call it foggy. And then a year-ish later, we introduce a full point system and a slightly more formal way to build forces. What does that sound familiar to? Oh yeah, it sounds familiar to 30 years later when they would release Age of Sigmar, and it would have no points and be kind of foggy and fuzzy on how you build armies, and people would kind of do their own thing. And then a year later, in the General's Handbook, they would introduce a formal point system. It's like poetry. It rhymes. So I thought that was just absolutely hilarious parallel. Some oddities from this. All statistics are now used numbers, which you'd think statistic would be a number, but it's not. That's the thing that got introduced here. We also had very different Slann. Keep in mind, there's no lizardmen. There's Slann. Slann are the name of the lizardmen race. The Slann army. We're going to dig into those on the next slide. Because Slann are very funny. No army has changed more than lizardmen. I think. That is to say, been a contiguous single force that has just completely redefined the nature of what they are. It's fascinating. They have simultaneously the most continuous existence with also the least similarity between their existence throughout the different changes. The other big thing that came in second edition was Ravening Hordes. Not the last time we're going to see this name, but Ravening Hordes was really important Really important. Really important. Okay, rule of threes. The official Warhammer Battle army list. See that down at the bottom? Yeah. So before this book, you didn't really have the concept of army lists in the way we think about them. Like, this is how the goblins go together and what they can do. And this is how the orcs, and this is the humans and stuff like that, the Empire. It was a lot more freeform in what you could do and how you could build. Ravening Hordes introduces the concept of sort of armies and army lists that would become the staple of Warhammer basically for years to come. So when Ravening Hordes comes out a few years after the release of 2nd edition, this was really where we set the tone going forward for the more or less up until the end of 8th edition. Ravening Hordes would also be the name we're going to use later, as we'll see when 6th edition rolls around. But to me, this is maybe the single most important publication from a rules perspective, because it codified this concept of armies as we would think of them over the next 6 editions. It would take until Age of Sigmar when they would be broken back apart, shaken up, and we'd have a completely different sort of way to put things together. But this would be the template that defined the way armies were thought of. That is, until we get to 3rd edition. Oh, gosh. Okay, so Warhammer 3rd edition. 3rd edition was released in 1987. It was, again, more of an evolution of the same concept. This is a single hardback book. It was incorporating previous material. Though it would be 1988 before any army lists were made available. You were told to just use Ravening Hordes before that. This was the first real definition of chaos during this edition, through the Realm of Chaos tomes, which were Slaves to Darkness, that sort of thing that would become that term, and the Lost and the Damned, which didn't stick as much. This edition was notable as it introduced war machines, it introduced a full point system. This was a very fascinating edition because, for so many reasons, 3rd edition was sort of the ultimate refinement of Warhammer fantasy in its early period. So one of the things you're going to see throughout the history here of Warhammer is that it will have a sort of way the rules work. Those rules will be somewhat messy or whatever. Editions will come out and sharpen the knife and refine it. And then it will get scrapped and a completely new thing will come in. So this is the knife edge. This is the apex of this era of Warhammer. Okay. 3rd edition basically integrated everything from going all the way back to 83. It added in officially all the stuff that had been articles. Like, there had been war machines in articles before and things like that in White Dwarf. This was sort of their official introduction to the rules. The formal point system and the way it worked was formally placed into the rules. It was the final sharpening of the knife of an era. And it would become a pretty definitive edition of Warhammer that a lot of people would never leave. So what we see happening when these big changes come in is that you leave behind a big section of the player base and they splinter off. Big section that's probably an overstatement. But what I will say is, to this day, there is an Oldhammer group, you can find them easy enough, fairly dedicated to playing 3rd edition Warhammer. They continue to keep it alive. Are they massive? No. But they exist. And at these hard breaks, we see this point where people just decide, like, I'm going to get off the train here, and this will be my evergreen edition of Warhammer. 3rd edition is also notable for a couple of interesting elements, namely some oddities like Fantasy Warlord. So Fantasy Warlord was started by people who had left Games Workshop. So what I found fun about Fantasy Warlord is this is the first example, but it is far from the last, of somebody leaving Games Workshop, starting a new game that is meant to compete ostensibly with Warhammer, and not being entirely successful at that thing. So Fantasy Warlord was interesting because it did have it had some unique elements to it. I would call it and I mean this is going to sound like such a loaded term, but I would call it the Kings of War of its day, because it just in the way that its movement rules worked, and it was a sort of scaled back system. It had much more definition. It had a lot more predictable elements than Warhammer had at the time. Again, it's not an exact parallel, and I don't mean anything more to that analogy than that. I'm really meaning it from the rules echo perspective. But it's just interesting that this will happen again and again, that people who leave Games Workshop will sort of try to make the new Warhammer, and it really doesn't ever work. Warhammer is somehow lightning in a bottle and very hard to recapture. Third edition also had a very complex movement system, hence one of the reasons why Fantasy Warlord tried to introduce this more predictable, simple movement system. This is where we see a lot of the introduction and formalization of a lot of the rules around things like retreating and not retreating, but I guess like running away is what I want to say. Being routed, that kind of thing. What I want to talk about here is an interesting unit that existed in this army. We talk about the Lizardmen, and I mentioned them being redefined. So now, finally, we're going to talk about that freaking frog. Here's that frog. All right, so let's talk about Slann. Slann would change a lot. Lizardmen. So previous to 4th edition, they were more or less just thought of as Slann. They didn't have the Lizardmen name, or at least not much. Certain things existed even here. The Emperor Mazdamundi. All right, still around. That guy would be around for a while. But, these were the Slann army. It wasn't a Lizardman army yet. But there is so much wonderful stuff on this page. So I thought this was fun because, first off, it shows you what the stats look like in this edition. And there were some elements that were similar and some that are different. As you see, there are some extra stats that would be gotten rid of later on. Obviously, some of the rules are very strange and different when you look at things like the leadership. You have these extra numbers in here, things like that. But I want to draw your attention to a couple of really interesting things in the Slann. First is this box right here. Now, I'm not going to read it out, but what it tells you, like this is the horrifying world of Warhammer 3rd edition. So basically, they still had this sort of Lustrian Aztec-y feel, and there's these settlers who are killing them. So the Slann raid and capture human settlers. These unfortunates suffer lobotomization and castration and are now slave troops, which that's what that picture is, by the way, over on the side. It's a Slann leader on a cold one with his human slave warriors. Oh, boy. The Lizardmen would obviously change their personality greatly as they move into the next edition. Some interesting things here. I pointed out the stats and how there are some echoes. We see the definition of what would become the sort of core base human stats. That's set here. Also, what I love is that there's a base size chart. As we sit upon the verge of Warhammer Age of Sigmar 2nd edition, where they're going to have a base suggestion chart, the units here had base sizes built in. Also here, we have this little psychology section I found fascinating. We have the introduction, obviously, of a lot of the names of special rules these weren't originated here. They existed before this, but I just wanted to point out their use. This sort of formalization of these keyworded rules. But there are still unique things happening in there, like troglodytes cause fear in creatures less than 10 feet tall. What? Obviously, things would be redefined in various ways later on, but, that would become things like fear in other non-creatures of this type or whatever. So, troglodytes would obviously become Kroxigor, Kroiger, however you say them. All these sorts of things. And the slave component would get ejected from the Slann when they become lizardmen. So, just a fascinating little walk through a specific instance here. As this really represents the end of an era. Because as we move into 4th edition, things are going to change. The world is changing. All right, so 4th edition, released in 1992. We go back to a box set from just a single hardback book. This is the first time you see the figures included. The previous box sets, by the way, were more like role-playing game box sets where they were just a box of books. This is the first time the figures are included. And there are about 100 figures in this box. If memory serves, it's like 40 elves and about 61 goblins, something like that. There's also, if you'll notice, I would like to draw your attention to those giant cards of like the orc on a wyvern. I know that's kind of a fuzzy picture. This is the best one I could find. There's not a lot of pictures of this stuff floating around, at least not that I could find. And the big elf on a griffin on the right side of the picture, those are standees that you would use to be these characters, rather than buying the fig. Now, the figs would either be released or would be available shortly afterward or were available then. But nonetheless, you could just keep using the standee. No base, just that's what it was. You had this little standee and it would fly around and that was your unit. It was a little cardboard thing. It's just fascinating that this was sort of a thing. You also see the little cardboard buildings. They gave you a couple pieces of terrain. It's just a fascinating box set. Again, this had like the templates and the dice and a lot of stuff we would come to see as staples for Warhammer from this point forward. One of the things that's interesting to me as the game goes along is we slowly see the integration and formalization of these components. And this is really where we see something that starts to look more like, if you're a Warhammer player playing now, chances are this is where Warhammer started to look like what you think of Warhammer as. Because that is to say, just statistically, most people probably started, who are watching this, probably started playing after 1992. Not everybody. I know several people in the community who started before that. But, you know, just raw numbers, this is probably where Warhammer comes to look like what you think of it as. I still have a bunch of the elves and goblins from this edition, but from this box set. So it was a fantastic box set. The magic system that had become really big and complicated was pulled out and became a separate entire sort of product. It, very funny again, given the upcoming release of the Malign Sorceries. But it was pulled out and became more of like a card game. That's one of the oddities of this edition. It was almost a mini game in and of itself, in the way that you sort of picked your cards randomly and then had this magic interaction in the game. It was very different. And this is sort of the only time in this period that one really gets used. It got adapted but changed, you'll see as we go into 5th edition. This was sort of the only time. Magic changes in every edition of Warhammer. It is the only non-constant. It's always dangerous and deadly. It's always very destructive. It's always sort of sourced from chaos or from dark powers. But the actual rules for it are just so wildly different in almost every edition of Warhammer. The way it works and the nuances of it would change in every edition. Sometimes drastically, sometimes not as much, but still in fairly critical ways. So, but this is kind of the only existence of this particular card game thing during this time period. So 4th edition was really quite successful, although going back and reading sort of interesting reviews of it and things about it, people found it at the time both. I saw lots of praise of things like the deal for the values, the miniatures, because there was so many you got. Like these were all plastic, what you got in here, and it was a really great deal by the standards at the time. of what came in here. So people liked that, but there was still a lot of like trepidation around some of the more complex elements of this game. And 4th edition and later 5th edition, which we'll talk about in just a second, would introduce a darker side of Warhammer, not in tone, but in the unfortunate way it played that became dominant through sort of the 90s. And that was Hero Hammer. It starts in 4th, it's a little weaker, and it comes into its own in 5th edition. So 5th edition was released in 1996. Again, we still have the box set. I got a better picture this time. Again, it looks much the same. We see the things like the templates. We have little red stick measuring sticks, which I still have a ton of in my house. I still have that little outhouse cardboard shack. I still have that. I don't have the castle or the other house anymore. I do still have all those Bretonnian knights and all those lizardmen. This was a box set of the famous battle, the extremely well-known, long-standing rivalry of Bretonnians versus lizardmen. This was the weirdest box set. Like, I remember even at the time when I saw this, I was like, what? What? Wait, who? Why? How? It was just the least sensible combination to put in a box set. I don't remember this one selling very well. I think a lot of people went back and bought the 4th edition box set instead, which had more useful figures in it, like high elves and goblins. At least that sort of makes sense. Sure, it's fairly classic, I guess. At least they probably fight more often. I don't know how often the crusading knights go over to the jungle. You know, nothing makes more sense than taking your barded heavy cav through the Amazon jungle, but whatever. But this was also the return of Bretonnians. Bretonnians had skipped 4th edition. They didn't really have any presence in it, and so this was sort of their reintroduction. Bretonnians in this time period were how I think of Bretonnians, because, again, this is when I was introduced to them, and we always define this by sort of when we were introduced to these things. And they were very Arthurian, very noble. They had some French influence. Bretonnia has always been a weird mix of sort of the Arthurian legend and the French knight system. But exactly how much of each varies by edition. In this one, there's still very much that noble Arthurian legend. They talk about, like, if a peasant does a heroic act, they're raised to a knight and stuff like that. So it's much more like that. This edition was classically hailed as Hero Hammer, and boy, oh boy, was that pretty true. I mean, you say this. All right, let's make this real. I want to make this real for our audience, for people who didn't play during this edition. Okay? So you have to understand, units at this time period were about 15 or 20 models. That was a standard size unit. But a lot of them were units of 5 or 10. You did not have the big units we would see in later editions. And characters, so if you remember how the way the stats work, characters, especially some things like chaos characters, would have things like weapon skill 9, strength 8, 10 attacks. These were pretty standard stat lines for them. And you could soup them up with magic items that would make them always strike first, hit with all attacks. So they would roll into combat on a horse or a monster or something. They would make 10 auto-hitting, strength 8 attacks, kill out easily, basically 7 or 8 guys. Could not be struck back because you didn't step up in combat. That's something that gets introduced later. So there was no piling in or stepping up or any of that. So if the dude showed up and smacked the whole front line dead, then he didn't get fought back. That unit would then run away. That was it. There was no fighting this guy in combat. Like, they were unkillable unless you had another version of your own, in which case then it was just sort of a luck thing. The only answer for things like this were cannons and a few things like that some of the other armies who couldn't manufacture super characters had. It was a real challenge in this time period. I played a lot in this time. This is when I got my Skaven, although I started on Empire, and I would watch units just crumble and explode to one dude. One guy would come in, blow up the unit. leave, next. Ironically, this did win the Origins Award. Origins, which is also, ironically, going on right now as I'm recording this. The Origins Game Fair. The Origins Award was a really big deal in the 90s, and this won the Origins Award for 1996. The Magic system was re-released and toned down. You could only cast during your turn. How about that? That's a funny thing that wasn't true before this. Again, so it was sort of rethought of again, and changed quite greatly, although you still see a lot of the things like the templates and all that sort of stuff is still very much a part of the game and would be for years to come. But this is sort of the sharpening of this decade, right? So over the 90s, we only had 2 editions. They lasted a fairly long time, each of them about 4 years. And if you look at the cadence of this, the release of AOS V2 is pretty much right in line with where we would expect on the average of how these editions have tended to go over the history of this game. But this was sort of the final gasp of this edition, and though a lot would stay the same, a lot would also change with the introduction of 6th edition. So 6th edition was released in 2000, and I couldn't find a good enough picture, but I decided instead to use this little picture of book release because we're going to talk about that. Again, you had a box set. This one had Empire in it. Classically, we had some handgunners and spearmen and a little teeny tiny baby cannon. It was this little cannon. So it was released in 2000. This was where Ravening Hordes, we get the second use of that title, as it was a sort of free, super low cost? I don't know. There were a million of them all over my room, and I literally can't remember how I got them all. But anyways, Ravening Hordes was released to update all armies to the new stats and new rules. So you had this single book that had rules for every army in the game. And that Ravening Hordes, little tiny softback paper covered thing, would last for years. Years. It was some army's only resource. Okay? Because, I mean, let's go jump over to this release schedule. So this is one of the longer editions of Warhammer. This one lasted 6 years. Pretty long time. And if you ever question the speed of a release, like sometimes people complain now, they have complained in AOS about the speed of the release. When's my time going to come? When am I going to get my book or whatever? I'd like to walk you through what happened in 6th edition Warhammer. So we have this Ravening Hordes release, which is great. Everybody has a thing. But it's a pretty thin thing. Okay? Like everybody got like 3 pages. It's not a lot of stuff. And then right with their releasing with the new edition, you got the Empire, which I was excited for. I played a little bit of my old Empire again. I had a buddy who played Empire, so that was great. But if you didn't play that, so you had Orcs and Goblins come a month later, Dwarves like 2 months later, okay? And then look at how far things get spaced out. You get maybe 3 books a year, 1 book in 2004, 1 book in 2005, before you get the Wood Elves book, sort of the last great gasp. The Dwarves release actually ends up being for 7th edition, basically. So there are armies that were just never touched here, really. And some that had people that had to wait a long, long time. And there wasn't a lot else in between. When you look at, like, there were 4 books released for Age of Sigmar already this year. You know, before, and they're all going to remain valid into the next edition. None of those books go away. With these edition switches, it varied whether or not the books were still useful. Often they could still be used, like famously this Skaven book that's released right here in March of 2002 is going to be the Skaven book used by Skaven for a long time to come. And this, you know, same with like the Bretonnian book and stuff like that. This will be, like, Skaven will eventually get some stuff in FAQs and other release information eventually before the end of the game. But like Bretonnia, more or less it's going to be riding, homie. This is pretty much ride or die. So it was very spotty. The many armies were redefined by the buy over this edition. Bretonia famously becomes much darker, loses a lot of its Arthurian nature, becomes much more sort of the French hierarchy and looking down on the peasants and things like that. The natures of like the hordes of chaos and the beasts of chaos, armies were sort of split up, split out, redefined, changed a lot in this. Vampire Counts and Tomb Kings being famously a big split from the previously unified undead. So things are sort of sharpened in this edition. If you go back and look at the 5th edition versions of some of these armies, they feel very different than how you probably think they feel if you started in 6th edition or later. There's a lot of the same core themes in them, but they weren't exactly the army you know today. In some cases. I mean, some of these are more or less have been the same throughout their entire history. Skaven have more or less been Skaven since Skaven were Skaven, and they Skaven to Skaven. You know, more or less the same with things like dwarves and stuff like that. But some of these would change quite dramatically. So there's still a lot of refinement during this time period. This introduced the dice rolling magic system. So that was kind of cool, which again would more or less stick around and be the case. Now, how exactly you accrue dice would change drastically, but that sort of dice rolling magic system would stick around. But this is really the template for fantasy battles until its conclusion. So this is the third wave, the wave of the 2000s, wherein this becomes the template for the next basically 15 years. Okay? All right. Until we get to 7th edition. 7th edition was released in 2006, making it one of the slower editions to come out. The Skull Pass box set, another great box set with little fun terrain bits and, you know, classic dwarves and goblins. Some really great minis, actually, that still hold up to this day. It was largely a refinement of 6th edition. It cut out some of the offending stuff, but it integrated a lot of rules refinement. The rules are creeping and creeping and creeping in size at this point that the physical, like, real rules section of the book, right? Like, what actually contains the things I need to know to play, was about 100 pages. A little less than. Armies are also getting larger. So an interesting trend from 6th to 7th to 8th is the rules are going to get more complicated because they're going to get refined, and so more and more corner cases are going to get mapped out. And the armies are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, looking back through the lens of history, that's bad. Okay? Now, I can't speak to what the incentive was at this time. I don't know what the people behind the scenes were thinking. Were they like, oh, our player base is shrinking, so we've got to make armies bigger so our existing player base buys more? I don't know. Maybe. Potentially. But I don't have any insight into that. What I will say is, from an outsider perspective, and, you know, looking through the 2020 lens of history, what you have over this 15-year period is armies getting larger and rules getting more complex. That's not good. That's bad. With those two things are happening, you do not have new blood. I went back and actually looked up. What's great about the 7th edition release is that it was like the internet was really a thing in 2006. The internet was, you know, in full swing. So I could go back and find reviews from the time period. And I read several reviews from new people. Like people who didn't really have any experience with Warhammer. So, you know, reviews of that time period largely were segmented into two different categories. People who were coming from 6th, who largely thought it was fine and didn't see any big problems. They had drank the Kool-Aid already. And people who had no experience with it and were coming in cold. And what you see is that people who came in cold found this game mystifying. Things like the movement rules made no sense to them, right? And like there was one review in particular where a reviewer was talking about he had his orcs and there was some people he wanted to charge, but he had left his giant standing in front of his orcs. So obviously you can't move one unit through another, and it didn't make any sense to him. This is a bunch of bloodthirsty orcs. They're going to run around their giant friend to go attack the enemy. They want to go kill the enemy. They're orcs, right? There was he was operating from a perspective of verisimilitude that the rules didn't allow, because it had these very complex movement rules, which would get more and more refined. And this edition introduces clipping, which is going to cause a whole bunch of weird oddities and be able to be abused. The magic system is given more power here, so commensurately, as armies are getting bigger, we're also tooling up magic to be able to deal with those bigger armies. Keep in mind, step up is still not a thing, so, that's still a problem depending on how things fight. But army building became quite varied in this time period. Armies were built in what I call like super versions of themselves. That's what would end up happening. Like you would have Skaven armies with 300 figures, or who were completely these sort of shooting armies, or whatever. That's probably more sixth. But what would happen is armies were able to become these sort of big enhanced versions of themselves because of the increase in size and points. And they started to look very, very, very different. Classically, a lot of armies would end up looking, especially in 4th and 5th edition, armies would largely feel very similar. You'd have a couple of units of smallish-sized infantry, a unit of smallish-sized cavalry, some kind of supplementary war machine or something, and a couple heroes were in a unit or on a monster, and then or a monster. And that was kind of the deal for most armies. They all kind of look like that. In this time period, you start to see a lot more divergence, where armies start to look extremely different and start to take on these very skewed natures of being built. And this wasn't a complete new thing here. To me, this is just sort of, looking back on it, this is sort of the height of it. Okay? But 7th edition would roll for a fair amount of time until we introduce the last edition. 8th edition, which would release in 2010, the Island of Blood box set. This, definitely, a lot of people still use figures of. All of my clan rats come from this. Most of my rat ogres come from this. These elves are still in common use, if anybody uses them. But not a lot of people use those high elves anymore, but if they do, these are largely the figs they use. The Island of Blood still had beautiful figures. Notably, every one of these Skaven figures composes the vast majority of my current Skaven army, between the rats and the ogres and the warlock engineers and everything. This box set would be released later on during Age of Sigmar as Spire of Dawn. 8th edition was a refinement of 7th edition, as 6 was before it, once again. So for the third time, we have this ultimate sharpening of a knife. So 3rd, 5th, and 8th become these flashpoints, where the game takes on all the refinement and answers to the questions of its previous editions, becomes its biggest, most itself, and then implodes. Because of drooping sales, or because of whatever, they have to reinvent it, and so on and so forth. Here we get the introduction of hordes, step up. We have rules like more ranks you can't break if you have more ranks than the enemy that's fighting you. We have very deadly magic in play, things like famously the old Purple Sun and Mind Razor and stuff like that, which are now both in the game. Purple Sun's about to come back in as its spell, but even in its form as an endless spell in AOS, it really doesn't compare to what it could do in Warhammer 8th edition, where there were certain armies and certain builds that could roll a Purple Sun through a large portion of the enemy army, and what would happen is, you could take out 5 to 1,000 points of models in a single spellcast. A quarter to half the army. That happened. Did it happen every time? No. Could it happen sometimes? Yes. That's real scary. Lots and lots and lots of models. This is the height of the model frenzy. With the introduction and rules incentive for hordes and that kind of stuff, it just became almost overwhelming. This edition had an immense barrier of entry. The rules are the most complex they've ever been. The armies are the largest they ever were. And financially, for the most part, it's believed it became untenable. Again, we don't understand why, and I'm not going to relitigate the end of 8th edition. I'm only here to report the history, and most of what has been said or publicly leaked out was that basically fantasy was dying. The directive came down from executives that, we're going to kill this line, and sort of there was this push to try something relevant and greatly reinvent it, which, by the way, was no different than what they had done already twice before. 4th edition reinvented off of 3rd. It was a completely different game. 6th edition reinvented off of 5th. Not quite as different, but still an extremely different game in a lot of big ways. And once again, we would see that happen with AOS. And this one lasted slightly longer. When you really look at the arc of it, sort of that first arc is about a little less than 10 years, about 9. The second arc is about 8. This one is about 15. So it had the biggest staying power, this particular arc. Why that is, it could be a fluke of history. It could be that they didn't want to throw good money after bad. Throughout this time period, 40K grows and becomes truly massive. And over time, like, this is focused on fantasy, but of course, at the same time, 40K was introduced later on and was growing and growing and growing. And as we shift into 2000s, 40K becomes actually the cash cow for Games Workshop. And so there was a focus away from it. Perhaps it lasted solely as a fluke. Like, they didn't want to invest more money into it. I don't know. All of that is circumspect, and all of that is just guessing. But what is definitely known is that this was a tough edition for barrier of entry. And the reality is that at the end, it had a great run, lots of years, lots of great games, but of course, the oddity from this one, it was the last edition of traditional Warhammer Fantasy Battles. At the end of 8th edition, we, of course, introduced something called the End Times. And that would see the end of the old world and then the birth into the Age of Sigmar. I think I'll do an entire separate video on the End Times and try to dig into some of the interesting elements from that, both within and without the world, from both a inside and a meta contextual sense. But there you go. So that's the history of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. I hope you found that interesting. I hope some of the stories were fun to go back and listen to and think about. Obviously, Warhammer has changed a lot over its time period from its roots in the early 80s as an extension of more or less a role-playing game created because Games Workshop had the rights to distribute D&D and had D&D on the brain, and so made a sort of mass fantasy battle role-playing game. This weird synergy of the two. It was largely narrative, very role-playing driven, and it would see itself evolve into a pure battle game, and its relation with narrative would come and go, its relationship with campaign would come and go, its relationship with comedy would come and go. But the strange nature of Warhammer as lightning in a bottle has continued to exist for 35 years now, and will probably continue to exist for many, many more, I would suspect. I don't see it going away anytime soon. But there it is. I hope you enjoyed it. Another tabletop history in the bag. If you liked this, don't forget to like. I would say subscribe for more tabletop history in the future. I hope to do more. These are long. These take a long time to prepare and research, and so these will be infrequent. I will do more, but I can't promise you when. But of course, you can subscribe for other stuff like our Hobby Cheating, Warhammer Weekly, and everything else we do here. And as always, feel free to share this. Sharing is always greatly appreciated. But I thank you very much for watching this one, and we'll see you next time.